Well, I have a very good relationship with President Xi. I find him to be a tremendous guy, and we get along well. And you see how we do. We're doing a lot of business with China and making a lot of money. We're making a lot of money. It's different than it used to be. But I'll be talking about that'll be one subject. But he's been very nice about this. In all fairness, he gets like 60% of his oil from Hormuz, and I think he's been very respectful. We haven't been challenged by China.
The White House has confirmed that the U.S. President Donald Trump will make a whirlwind visit to Beijing and meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The trip was once postponed due to the Iran conflict. It is now expected to focus on at least three main issues, namely Iran, trade, and Taiwan. So how will the Iran conflict affect the U.S. and China relationship going into the summit? Will they reach meaningful agreement on economic friction issues like trade, tariff, and technology controls? And finally, how will they handle the issue of Taiwan and, by extension, the integrity of the first island chain deterrence framework? Welcome to Taiwan Talks, everybody. I'm Wendy Song. Joining me tonight are our speakers, Bryce Barrows, INDSR Visiting Fellow, and Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica Assistant Research Fellow of Political Science. Ronan, Bryce, thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
All right, let's go right in. And Ronan, let me ask you from the start, what do you expect to come out of this Trump-Xi meeting? Should we keep our expectations high or low?
I think we should keep our expectation low because of the unpredictability of Trump. So if we actually, basically just lay out, what they want to achieve. For Trump, for the U.S., they want to prioritize three things: trade, rare earths, and Iran. And for China, for Xi Jinping in particular, Taiwan sits on top of the priority, right? So, but as you can probably imagine that, Trump is unlikely to give in so that, China can get whatever they want. By the same token, China is not going to just surrender everything just to honor, what Donald Trump asked them to do. So my prediction is that they are going to reach something substantive, including, trade and maybe, rare earths. So both sides will actually, take a step back and trying to accommodate, at least partially, the other side's needs. But my prediction is that they are not going to make substantive, statement when it comes to Taiwan. Yeah, that'll be my prediction.
How about you, Bryce? I'm wondering, how do you think this issue that's on many people's mind over the last month or so, of course, is the Iran war? Do you think the outbreak of the war and the way it's been going is giving Xi or maybe Trump a stronger hand going into the summit?
I think what it reveals is, ironically enough, a layer of strategic interdependence between the U.S. and China, given the interest that they both have in wanting to open up the Strait of Hormuz, right? So for Trump, he wants to be able to show most likely that the U.S. can manage multiple conflicts and different issues at multiple times, right? If you look at how the Trump administration went from Venezuela to Iran, potential signaling that they have on Cuba, and then simultaneously, for Xi, I think it shows that how important energy security has been for China's rise, and how without that regional stability, it won't allow China to be able to achieve some of the economic goals that it wants, or it can hinder them potentially, while also providing an opportunity for Xi to appear as more of a regional stabilizer, right? With some of the different initiatives that they've attempted to do in the Middle East in the last few years. So I think I wouldn't say that one has leverage over the other. I think that they both are looking for different things that they can angle for, and whichever one might come on top in the summit is very much in the air.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Roland? Given that the way U.S. has been handling Iran conflict so far, how do you think it's affecting how China is perceiving American confidence and maybe competence at the moment? And again, who is giving a stronger hand to, China or the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think it can go both ways. And for the moment, Beijing's lesson from watching the world as an outsider is that they actually will start questioning the U.S. Competence, but not capability. But it's very clear that the U.S. can break things. And the world already knew it. So now the question is, can Washington finish what is started? right? So like if it can finish what it started, basically the U.S. will have the capability and the willingness so that there's no question, when it comes to their competence and their capability. But right now, because of the entire situation, Beijing is possible to question, Washington's competence, right? So right now, I think who is basically seizing the upper hand. I don't think that neither side actually seizes the upper hand because for Beijing, even if the U.S. cannot really get the job done, it's actually not like a piece of cake. But through Venezuela and through striking against Iran, the U.S. has demonstrated that it has the capability to harm, to impose severe harm onto other countries, and Beijing definitely has to take that into consideration.
Right, okay. I like that distinction between objective capability on the one hand and more, I guess, intersubjective competence, or that's more to do with the political machinery at the moment. And how about you, Bryce? When you look at this Iran conflict and China's role in it, let's look at the other side, right? Not just US-Iran, but Iran-China. How do you think China is balancing its relationship with Iran, meanwhile not let that Chinese support for Iran undermine or destabilize China-U.S. relations at this juncture?
I think the question for them is that they recognize that the United States still holds major advantages across the region, right? The U.S. still has allies that it works very closely with. Obviously, Israel being the impetus for wanting to join the war, which is what the administration has said legally was the justification. But also, U.S. is very close with other parties involved in it, right? So UAE, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, obviously places like Turkey, Cyprus, more than a dozen countries that are around Iran's periphery, even U.S. military ties with Pakistan, historically speaking. Getting through that coalition, being able to sort of break that off in however way. And this is not just an issue in the Middle East, right? Goes towards NATO, goes towards even here in the Indo-Pacific as a big part of that.
All right. So important part of a puzzle you highlighted. U.S. still has significant, be it RMA, military, tech, and also I guess diplomatic networks in its favor. And how about you, Roland? How do you look at this? Is that relationship with Iran for China, is Iran now an asset or more of a liability for China going into this meeting with the U.S. side?
I think in the eyes of CCP leaders and Xi Jinping, I think they will try to play the Iran card. But I don't think that they can really, make things happen because, from the outside world, we might believe that, Beijing actually gets the upper hand, but it's perhaps not in the eyes of Donald Trump, because President Trump could very well believe that, he has everything under control. So the U.S. and Iran are about to, strike a deal, which could entirely not materialize in the foreseeable future. But the point I'm trying to make is that unless Trump believes that he's losing, unless he's helping that when Beijing comes in, problem can be solved. Otherwise, even Xi Jinping and Beijing believes that they have the upper hand, they have the card to play. Things are not going to go their wish. Yeah.
All right, so who has upper hand is in the eyes of a beholder as well, and that perception, if not sufficiently shared, cannot affect policy outcomes in the same way. All right, so much for fog of war, isn't it? All right, so let's talk about another dimension of the U.S.-China relations at this moment, and that is much more economic side of the equation. And here I want to talk about this issue about the Trump-Xi summit. During the lead up to it, there's a flurry of recent high-level engagement between the two sides at the cabinet official level. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent first held a virtual meeting with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. On the same day, U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio also spoke by phone with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Both exchanges were aimed at paving the way for a smooth Trump-Xi meeting. So goes the expectation. Even on this often stalled issue, however, of tariff and trade, Scott Bessent has expressed some optimism there. Watch.
I actually think we're going to be building on those gains in terms of the trade deficit dropping with China. Since last summer, there's been great stability in the relationship, and really the keystone to the relationship is the strong respect that the two leaders have between each other. My experience has been when the communication is at the top, then we follow that directive and those wishes.
Bryce, State Secretary, Treasury Secretary both spoke with their Chinese counterparts, but one person that seems to be missing, however, is the U.S. Defense Secretary. I'm just wondering, should that be a cause of concern? Do they say something about the kind of main agenda item that's going to be on the Trump-Xi meeting?
I don't think it's a cause for concern at all. So I would summarize them all as focusing on economic stability and geopolitical competition. And if that's what you're looking at, it makes sense that the Treasury Secretary, as well as the Secretary of State, would also be the people who'd be leading that. I think it's also important to remember, too, one thing that Trump has been consistent about throughout his public, life in public is an emphasis on economics and trade, right? One of the big things that he did that really changed U.S. foreign policy when he came into office in 2017 was prioritizing the National Economic Council over the National Security Council. So keeping in that sort of memory, and then also, thinking about the role that, Secretary Passett has played even in, sort of like trade negotiations with U.S. allies over the different tariffs that the Trump administration levied, in addition to China, it makes a lot of sense that he would be involved in those discussions too, because a lot of that sort of grand sort of deal is presumably going to be economic in nature, and whatever political things that come up that involve like rare earth metals or potentially Taiwan, that's obviously a State Department related thing. So I don't think it's a bad thing that the Department of Defense is not, or rather the Defense Secretary is not also being brought in to those discussions as well.
Yes, Roland.
I think that the summit is deliberately framed as one that is diplomatic and economic by its very nature. So by using that as the premise, what we can actually anticipate from the summit is that some security or high politics issues, we are not going to see any security commitment, that kind of agreement coming out from the summit. So what you are going to see potentially is economic and some diplomatic arrangement.
All right, so sounds like economic security will be at the front of the agenda. Maybe high security issue, maybe we shall see what happens to it later. So, all right, so speaking of economic security then, Roland, how do you think they're going to go about handling the tariff war? I mean, you mentioned this a bit earlier as well, but do you see a meaningful, lasting deal on the horizon? Or are we more looking at a ceasefire as some kind of modus vivendi and the kick the can down the road?
Yeah, so I think, to your point, I don't think that a lasting deal is on the horizon. It's fairly difficult, and so Trump is going to stay there for just a little bit over 24 hours. I don't think that something that substantive and that solid can actually be achieved during that short period of time. But I do see, some possibility of the dynamics of give and take. Happened. So it's entirely possible that Beijing can offer, okay, so we are going to purchase soybeans from you guys, Boeing, and then in return, we are going to do this to accommodate your needs. So this is the kind of the dynamics of give and take that I'm trying to describe. Yeah.
All right, so speaking of give and take, one thing that's happened a few months ago, namely December last year, on the more technology competition front, was that Trump administration authorized the sale of NVIDIA's advanced AI chips H200 to China. So in giving that, U.S. government asked to get 25% or so tariff on the sale of those AI chips, if I'm not mistaken. And so in that sense, Bryce, how do you think they're going to handle the issue of tech export controls at this meeting? Do you expect anything to come out of it?
I do expect maybe some things to come out of it, but I also want to take that as an opportunity to highlight a recent bipartisan congressional delegation to China that was announced by Senator Daines, and I believe 3 other Republicans, as well as Senator Maria Cantwell. And something I thought was really interesting about that, and this goes beyond just Xi and Trump discussing it, is the whole purpose of that delegation to China is to get insights into Chinese technology ecosystem. So even if Trump and Xi come up with some kind of deal where they, relate to NVIDIA H200s or what have you, I do think that there's a broader sort of interest that's even bipartisan in the United States to want to understand China's tech innovation ecosystem even better, and then also do what it can to prevent, unrestricted sort of like high-end technology transfers and other sort of things as well, where that might even come into conflict within the U.S. government with what the White House might want.
Interesting. So one thing that people talk about for the last few years, of course, is the logic of de-risking or decoupling between China and other Western economies. So we're seeing more trend of that accelerating in recent years as well. So when people are increasingly talking about China plus one in their business and investment strategies, we are seeing supply chains gradually finding their way to diversify out of China, albeit in a perhaps 2 step forward, 1 step backwards direction.
Yeah.
Roland, how do you think this trend, though, of diversifying supply chain away from China, is it going to reduce Beijing's economic leverage vis-a-vis US, or is it actually somehow liberate Beijing since it's not dependent on Western markets so much more, it can have its way a bit more?
I think both trends that you just described when they are happening. So on the one hand, the U.S. can rely on Beijing for technology less, but at the same time, what is happening is that because of the lack of supply of the high-end NVIDIA chip, so they have to figure something out on their own. So that will create some technological autonomy from Beijing, right? So on the one hand, you see 2 different supply chain logics out there. So one basically is like red, represented by China. The other basically is like United States. So the US, UK, even Taiwan and South Korea and so forth and so on. So that is happening. But we also see, in recent months, the technological circle in Beijing and also in Shanghai and some other provinces, they have made substantive improvement. Why? Because they could not actually secure the supply from the U.S. or from some other country. So once they start working on their own, trying to figure something out, and once they figure something out, strategic autonomy will be earned, by Beijing. So that's the reason why I think both trends that you just described are happening.
That's interesting. So one aspect of that, people, back in Lincoln's day, they used to talk about guardrails all the time, right, in strategic competition between U.S. and China. Bryce, I'm wondering, how do you look at this economic security dimension of the competition? Do you see the meeting to be resulting in any kind of new ways to manage the guardrails of the economic competition, or some way to redefine the acceptable boundaries of economic competition?
I think the key thing is going to be seeing if the Trump administration is able to push for, more sort of like things like soybeans, for example, or other sort of products that not only is very key to Trump's sort of like voter base, but also are very keen on wanting to ensure that there's a smooth U.S.-China relationship, just because those happen to be some of their biggest markets. So I think that that's the bigger thing to sort of keep an eye out for in terms of where the economics of this can go. But, once again, the president likes to fancy himself as a negotiator, likes to fancy himself as someone who can negotiate hard. So it might not be as simplistic as that as well. It could really go either way. But if I had to put a speculative, educated guess, I think a big part of that is ensuring that the places that he feels supports them the most, especially some of those farmer communities, are currently hit very hard, especially by fertilizer and other sort of things that are not coming through the Strait of Hormuz as much, have a market to export to continue to make more money is a big thing.
So one other issue that's on many people's mind is how Taiwan will come up in the Trump-Xi meeting. Indeed, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi told U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio that Taiwan remains the greatest risk factor in the U.S.-China relations. Rubio later issued a warning at the White House press briefing, stating that any destabilizing developments in the Taiwan Strait would benefit neither the U.S. nor China. Take a look.
I'm sure Taiwan will be a topic of conversation. It always is. As you know, we understand the Chinese understand our position on that topic. We understand theirs, and I think both parties, without getting ahead of myself of what will happen in the talks, but I think both countries understand that it is neither one of our interests to see anything destabilize happen in that part of the world. We don't need any destabilizing events to occur with regards to Taiwan or anywhere in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's to the mutual benefit of both the United States and the Chinese.
Ronan, what's your response to that address, and how do you think Taiwan issue will be discussed more broadly at the Trump-Xi meeting?
Yeah, so for starters, Taiwan for sure will be discussed during the summit. That's almost like a guarantee. And secondly, basically, over the years, Beijing and Xi Jinping in particular have been trying to, urge the United States to actually improve or upgrade, their rhetoric strategy, basically from, do not support Taiwan independence to we oppose or we basically object Taiwan independence. But I don't think that is going to happen, in Beijing's favor, because basically Trump really, committed to Taiwan issues in public. I don't see, he started doing that in Beijing. So that's one. Number two, as Rubio just said, basically any destabilizing factor should be, discouraged, should be contained. Basically, the U.S. will not support any unilateral change of the status quo, right? So we are not going to see that coming out from the summit. The U.S. suddenly announced that, okay, so we are going to abandon Taiwan. I also don't think that they are going to say, we oppose this, and that. This is definitely not, Trump style.
All right, so it sounds like maybe more continuity and change on the Taiwan front. How about you, Bryce? Is China going to make an offer that Trump cannot refuse and therefore strike a grand bargain over Taiwan?
So I want to echo your comments and sort of give another aspect to provide like a perspective on it, which is, as you mentioned, 100%, Taiwan is always a flashpoint that's discussed between U.S. and Chinese officials. I think where people in Taipei are watching for is whether or not Taiwan as a discussion point potentially becomes linked to these other issues that are economic, trade, technology, geopolitical bargaining. That's where maybe a grand bargain becomes more of something that's like worth keeping an eye out for. But I also think that there are a lot of structural forces that would really not make it in the best interest of the administration and or the U.S. just to go ahead and create some kind of grand bargain on on Taiwan, right? So U.S. allies, for example, members of Congress are still relatively vocal about that, and if there was something to happen, you might see pushback from members of Congress on that, and also just like sentiment across like the American public, though. However, maybe we could see things like slower arm deliveries, right? Less diplomatic signaling, disencouragement of high-level engagement. Little things along those lines are worth watching for after the summit.
Right, little things might just add up, isn't it? How about you, Roman?
Yeah, so that's what I think from the Taiwanese perspective. Worry, yes. Panic, no. And here's why. So I think the real risk is not that we're going to see like a grand bargain between the United States and China in this one meeting. I don't think that is going to happen. But the real risk lies in the commitment erosion, like the postponing or delaying the arms supply. So these are all concession. Individually they look manageable in isolation.
Right.
But cumulatively speaking, it's inevitably sending like a signal to Beijing that perhaps American resolve has a price, and this will be bad, right? So that's the reason why grand bargain not going to happen, but some piecemeal concession, maybe, yeah. But we still have to take that into account and be very, very wary of that.
There was a press report back on February 16th from the Associated Press when Trump told a press briefing at the time, or rather told the press that he was in discussion with Chinese President Xi Jinping concerning U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which some observers described as a departure from long-standing U.S. position, especially as stated in the U.S. Six Assurances to Taiwan. Maybe I'll start with you, Bryce. How do you feel about this? Should Taiwan be concerned?
I think it's something that Taiwan needs to monitor very closely and see what happens. But the admin has approved several packages recently. This administration has placed on wanting to encourage manufacturing and production in the United States. Politically, it might be a little bit more difficult for them to turn it away, especially depending on where the different munitions and different other arms and whatnot that are included in the package are made in the United States, if it's viewed as being within the president's sort of like best interest.
So one other thing I want to ask is about Taiwan President Lai's Eswatini trip that we know is went through a few ups and downs. Initially, China managed to make it difficult for Taiwan President Lai to go. Eventually, he did manage to go there and come back to Taiwan safely. Roland, how do you think that trip and the diplomatic tug of war surrounding it might affect this Trump-Xi meeting?
I think that, so on the one hand, Xi will try his very best to make sure that the U.S. can actually move its position, even for an inch, right? So, but I'm not sure, whether he will intentionally, brought this issue up, because that also, suggests that China actually has failed to stop the trip from materializing, right? Obviously, they made the trip difficult, but in the end, Laiching or Taiwan, emerged victorious, right? So I don't think that Xi Jinping is going to brought this up intentionally, but I do think that the POA, China or POA in particular, they perhaps are going to respond a little bit. But in terms of skill, not as strong and intensified as the one after the Pelosi visit. But my prediction is that they are going to respond basically because of the success of the Laiching visit.
All right, on that note, that's about all the time we have. But I'd like to thank you, Roland, thank you, Bryce, both, for coming today. All right, guys, that's our show. Thank you for tuning in. Come check us out on YouTube. And until next time, it's good night from us from Taipei.